Hello friends, my name is Marines, and today I'd like to talk about review spaces and authorial intent. I'll start you at the very beginning here. So over the last week, I saw a handful of tweets that were talking about reviews being for readers. This is a discussion that comes up cyclically in the book community, so I didn't really think much of it, at least in terms of trying to figure out what people were talking about or what, if anything, happened. In this case, people were referencing something specific. Daniel Green is a popular SFF booktuber who is publishing his first novella, Breach of Peace, at the end of this month. Advanced reader copies of his novella are out, and Green made a video sort of reacting to a piece of criticism that he received about the portrayal of cops in his story, as the main characters of this novella do belong to a police force. Green uses this as a bit of a jumping off point to touch on the subject of authorial intent and what he calls author freedom, and to express his authorial intent. The review he was referencing was also cross-posted on Reddit, where a now locked discussion started about real-world context in fantasy worlds, with people also weighing in on whether or not they would read Breach of Peace based on this review. I think it was primarily some of these comments that Green wanted to respond to, especially as they were ascribing to him, the author, the morality of his characters. I read through the thread and I didn't see any of these particular responses. However, by the time I got to it, certain comments had been removed by moderators for violating their kindness rule, which is also their rule that covers arguments made in bad faith. Green also responded directly to the original reviewer on Goodreads, and he makes clear in his video that this is a person he considers a friend, and from what I can tell, the reviewer didn't mind the direct response. He said, in fact, that he was happy to have this dialogue with Green. I also thought it was interesting, though, that in this response, the reviewer doesn't offer any ways for Green to improve his novel, and in fact says, "My job as a reviewer is more to respond to the text than to suggest changes." I wanted to provide all of that as context, and the original review, the Reddit thread, and Green's video will all be linked in the description. To be clear, in his video, Green repeats the fact that he believes the criticism of his work is valid, and he wanted to use this as a jumping off point to express his intent and to stress the importance of authorial intent and authorial freedom. In his response to the reviewer on Goodreads, he states that he has been preaching for a long time now that creators and reviewers should be able to have a dialogue. With all of that said, I'd like to use his video and some of the discussions in the Reddit thread as my own jumping off point to discuss three things here. One is review spaces, two is authorial intent, and three is authorial freedom. Social media has made it so that readers can much more easily connect with other readers, readers can connect with reviewers, and readers and reviewers can connect with authors. As we participate in these various spaces, we each have our own way of viewing and cultivating and moderating and assembling our boundaries. So there is not going to be one universal consensus on how we should treat social spaces in the book community. I personally firmly land in the camp that says that reviews are for readers and are almost always never for authors. To that same end, I think that readers should exercise extreme caution when bringing authors into review spaces by, for example, tagging them in reviews, especially ones that are negative or very critical. The review to me is not meant for the author. The author is not my audience. The review is not an open dialogue between a reader and an author. If an author wants a review from me in a setting where there is an open dialogue in order to improve their writing, they can pay me. That's called editing. The review is for other readers. Here is how I felt about this book. Here is how I experienced this book. Here is what I thought about the quality of this book, etc. Reviews help other readers make decisions about what books to read and what books to invest limited resources such as time and money into. An interesting thing that I saw on the Reddit thread was a few people being shocked that others were saying, based on this review, I'm choosing not to read Breach of Peace. But like, that's what a review can be used for. It's 100% true that I will not know with absolute certainty how I will feel about a work until I read it myself. But because I can never hope to read all of the things that have ever been written, I have to use various methods for curating what I will read. And one of those methods is definitely reading and watching reviews and hearing not only what people didn't like about a work, but what they liked about it. To tie it to this specific example, whether or not people think that the godlike cops at the helm of Breach of Peace were written effectively, or whether or not they enjoy those characters or their function within the world. A reader deciding that a book that has sympathetic godlike cops at the helm of it is not a story that they personally want to consume is valid. We make those decisions all the time when it comes to our media, and I'd rather not see for myself is a choice that you can make and that we all make. Part of why I think it's important to have these lines drawn between review spaces and author spaces does come down to authorial intent versus death of an author, which I'll talk about later, but also because there is a power dynamic issue here. When a creator is entering a consumer or fan space, that is not an equal power dynamic, and that is true regardless of the interaction, but it is particularly concerning when we are talking about author responses to a review. There are so many other ways that an author can connect with the reader and where there can be that dialogue between the author's intent and the reader's experience. I don't think that a response to a review is one of those ways. These are generalizations, of course, and I'm not saying that there is never a situation where the author can't speak up, especially when it's less about interpretation and more about misrepresentation. A good example of this is Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This book takes place in Mexico in the 1950s, and one of the characters has a seizure and another character puts a spoon in their mouth, which is an old wives' tale about how you stop a seizure. One reader spoke up about the harmfulness of this portrayal of seizures, and Moreno Garcia responded, not specifically to the criticism of this portrayal being bad, but to clarify a point. The spoon thing is challenged in the text. A doctor tells the main character that using a spoon does not work. And Moreno Garcia wanted to clarify to her readers that you should also not try this at home. Now, your mileage may vary on even this case about whether or not Moreno Garcia should have responded to this criticism. But that's the thing, we're all going to have different takes on how authors can or should interact with reviews. From what I've seen, Green is retweeting reviews and even agreeing with their more negative criticisms, and I personally think that this is crossing a boundary that I would like to see preserved. Specifically because it's all fun and games until an author finds a criticism or a review that they don't agree with, or that they get upset with, or that they would like to challenge. And because I don't think that it is enough protection for the author or the creator to agree with the criticism. Often the author has a much bigger platform and is exposing the criticism to their fan base. It feels irresponsible. And I've seen people praising Green for this method of engaging with his reviews and with his criticisms, and I don't think that they realize or that they're acknowledging that there is a really good reason that many authors do not. Okay, second we have authorial intent. At face value, we understand the words authorial intent to mean the author's purpose, what they set out or what they resolved to do. Authorial intent in literary criticism or critical theory has a bit more to it than that. Authorial intentionalism is the position that the author's intent should inform the way that we read and or constrain the way that we interpret. It makes the author the authority of the interpretation, and any interpretation that is not in line with that has to defer to the author's intent. The opposite of this is death of the author, which in literary criticism means that the author's intent is irrelevant and that the reader is the authority on the interpretation of that text. Once a work is out in the world, it stops belonging to the author and it now belongs to the readers. Authorial intent and death of the author are 2 points on a scale that we can use to consider this question, and more than that, I think that they are 2 lenses that we can use when we are critically engaging with media. I personally feel like I slide all over the scale. On the one hand, I am somebody that looks up information about the author after I finish reading a book, checking out interviews or videos or panels of them discussing their own work and adding that to my sort of like basket of context. I am sometimes interested in the author's intent, albeit in a limited capacity, especially because I strongly believe that intent does not negate impact. Despite the simplified version of what the author's intent is, they are bringing to that intention and to everything they write their worldview, their biases, their knowledge and understanding, and the context of how they exist in the world. I'm not saying that authors bake those beliefs into every character that they write, but that even a statement like, "I wrote about godlike cops with whom I disagree with," is inherently tied to a worldview. These are all big concepts, which is why I like thinking about them as lenses, something that you can put on and take off as you are considering a piece of media. You can consume a work and engage with it at a bare minimum level. I don't think that we're ever not engaging with it at all, but you can let a story wash over you, put it aside after you're done, and never think about it again. Conversely, you can start putting on these lenses and considering the work in the context of the time and place from which it was written. Consider the work in the context of the time and place from which you are consuming it. Consider the intention of the author. Consider your own reaction to and interpretation of the work, and how your own worldview and biases and knowledge and understanding and context for how you exist in the world inform that reaction, inform that interpretation. By the time I get to this point in the discussion, lots of people groan and they're just like, ugh, it's just fiction, I just read for fun. But all of us are doing this work, at least at some level, and we do it sort of naturally. Even as things as simple as asking ourselves, did I like that? We're doing some of this critical analysis. We don't think about it in so many words, but when you are looking up information about an author after you consume a story, that is a piece of looking into who the author is, what their context is, and sometimes what their intention is. Or you might say in this specific example, which is something I saw repeated on the Reddit thread, but it's just fantasy. It's removed from the real world. But we can still employ these lenses to view fantasy. Fantasy does not exist in a vacuum. The author's intentions don't exist in a vacuum, and the reader's experience does not exist in a vacuum. How important you think the author's intent is up to you. But I personally reject the notion that the reader's interpretation has to bow in the front of the author's intent. As a reviewer, I'm the interpreter here in this space. And this ties back to review spaces and having those boundaries between where there is interpretation by the reader happening and sort of introducing the author's intent as the sort of word of God in those spaces. And finally, we'll address the idea that Green refers to as author freedom. I mentioned before that I believe this comes a lot from the responses in that Reddit thread, and that some people were apparently ascribing to Green sort of the political beliefs or the morality of his fictional characters. So his point is that he thinks it is so important, so crucial, that authors have the freedom to write about a perspective they don't believe in, and to do so freely without judgment on them. And so it seems that Green's theory of authorial freedom comes in two parts: the freedom to do and the freedom from a certain kind of consequence. Let's state the obvious first and say that the freedom is there. You can write about whatever the heck that you would like. You can write about any type of character that you would like. The issue seems to be the freedom to do so without the consequences of readers interpreting this as they will, or the fairness of ascribing traits or belief to a person based on their fiction. To be clear, I think it is wild to assume that authors only write about things that they agree with, or that an author condones the behaviors or the beliefs of all of their characters, or anything as overly simplistic as that. I would add that a key factor for me is messaging. To generalize with an example, let's say you write a book about an abusive boyfriend, but you maintain that you do not agree with or condone abusive relationships. The question to me is, what does this book say about abusive relationships? Not every book is an allegory, and the intention of the author may be wildly removed from persuasion or information. But regardless of their intent, bits of the author are in that work, bits of their worldview, and that story has said something to each of its readers. If the majority of readers walk away from this totally fictional and made-up example of a book about an abusive boyfriend, thinking that the abusive boyfriend is hot and dreamy and that the relationship depicted is something to shoot for, I feel like in that instance I do have some room to make larger connections to a worldview or to societal context. The freedom is there to write whatever you would like to write, but in creating things and putting them out for consumption, you are also agreeing to the consumer's freedom to interpret that in whatever way they will. I'd like to reiterate that this wasn't a direct response to Green's video, because I'm talking more broadly about concepts he just brings up in that video and about conversations that have sprouted up around that video and around his work. But you guys know how fascinating I find all of this stuff, how much I enjoy discussions, and how much I truly believe that critical engagement with media matters. So what do you guys think? I know I covered a lot in this video, but I would love to chat with you guys about what you think in terms of authors engaging with their reviews or responding to reviews, and also the balance between authorial intent and death of an author. Also, are you going to read Breach of Peace? His audience is way bigger than mine, but in making this discussion, I have given him a free bit of marketing, so let me know if you are interested in this novella. I think I might be at this point, not because of anything in the story, but particularly because of the conversation that is happening about the portrayal of police in this fictional world and sort of the real world connections to police brutality in the United States. Green has said it wasn't his intent to make those connections at all, but we know this is also the context from which he is writing from. Some of the things that I've heard people say in order to prove that this fake world is so different than police brutality in the United States has been wild. And so now I'm like, well, I gotta read it. We'll see. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. And so now I'm like,